Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Transforming Assessment webinar series for 2017. This session is about getting started with assessment and the feedback in higher education, and the presenter is Professor Sally Brown, who's now Emerita Professor at Leeds Beckett University and an independent consultant. So if you want to know anything about assessment, get in touch. We're also doing a preview. This is kind of serving as a preview session for the Assessment in Higher Education conference that's happening in the UK this year in late June. So, Sally, would you like to begin, please?
Good morning, everybody. It's really nice to be talking to quite a few people about the topic I'm completely obsessed with. I'm very grateful to Matthew, particularly, for being so incredibly supportive with me with the technology, and also for inviting me to do this. I'm billed on the sheet as Emerita Professor of Leeds Beckett University. That was my last job as a wage slave, and I'm now a gloriously independent consultant and just do things I feel like doing. And I'm very grateful to be associated with the Assessment in HE conference, which I believe is the best conference around in the UK for assessment and HE professionals. Also, very warm welcome to everybody from all over the world. I was delighted when I saw the list. We've got people from 4 continents taking part, so that's delightful. I'm just going to work through my slides, and as Matthew says, the slides are always available through him, and also if you'd like to look at my website, sally-brown.net, you'll see all the slides we use will be there. So I'm going to be working through these slides, but not in a sort of over-dominating fashion, I hope. And I'm hoping that people will be joining in and typing into the text box as well to let me know you're there. Thank you to the person who tells me you're coming in from Tasmania at 6 o'clock in the night. This session is all about getting started in assessment, and it's principally designed for people who are real novices at assessment, but it's also for people who are supporting those getting started in assessment. And as I've mentioned in one of my slides, the materials are based on some work I did with Sharon Waller, Erica Morris and Margaret Price at Anglia Ruskin University. You might like to have a look at those resources because it's called the Anglia Assessment Album. They're open educational resources, and I think there's some jolly good things in there that are available for people to link. Thank you, Matthew, for putting the live link straight in there. Loads of stuff there you can use, and we're always very happy if you let us know how you get on. One thing I've put into those resources, something I really love doing, is a game called the Biscuit Game. If you live in a country like the UK where biscuits are part of life, this will probably work really well. If you live in America and biscuits mean something completely different, it won't work quite so well for you. So we're on a journey through this session. There will be some activities involved, but for the first part, I'm going to be working through a few slides. For me, doing assessment right is really, really important. This isn't just because if we do it wrong, like David Bowles says, good students can avoid bad teaching, but they can't avoid bad assessment. It does really impact on how students do. And I think if you think back to your own experiences of when you were being assessed, we know, don't we, that it can be the most demotivating or the most motivating opportunity that we have. It's a key locus of directing student effort, and it's a key way that we actually integrate what we do and make sure students are engaging with the university. Good morning, Kay, and everybody else. Students' lives after graduation can be really impacted if they have a tough time in university assessment. And certainly among our families, probably a number of us have members of our families who actually have been badly affected by this. I've certainly got 2 sons who have dropped out. Both sons then went back many years later after being bruised and came out of it very good. But I think we want to try and avoid that kind of bruising experience if we can. I think universities, I'm not afraid to say we have a moral commitment to students, and indeed to the new assessors. I've talked to lots of people who tell me that they were thrown in at the deep end and just told, oh, well, you're a bright girl, just get on, you've got a PhD, you can assess. Well, that's not good enough, I'm afraid, and that's the reason I'm very committed to try and make sure that everybody has a good start in learning how to assess. And if we don't assess well, then as I say, poor quality and unreliable outcomes really are the result of that. Lots of people joining the room. I can see people from all over the place. Matthew's reminding you to use the audio wizard. I hope you can all hear. Always nice to see the odd comment coming in on the chat box, so please feel free to use it. I've put up a cartoon here, which is a historic cartoon I've been using for at least 30 years. I've tried over many years to find the origin of it. I certainly know I was using it back in the 90s. Lots of people like this cartoon because it shows a number of students who are being asked to take the same assessment. Now, I think it's obvious that not everybody has absolutely equivalent opportunities to undertake assessment. I'd like to be the bird in the bottom corner there, but maybe the fish was told when he started the course that all he was expected to do was to rise up vertically, and he could have done that. It's a tree bit he didn't know about. So I think what we need to do is think about how we can make sure assessment actually gives people equivalent, if not identical, assessment opportunities. You may want to think about that and ask yourselves about your own assessment. Are we sometimes treating all our students as if they're all blackbirds or monkeys? So lots of us in the UK have been working on a big project called A Marked Improvement. It's available as a download. It's also, there are some rare hard copies still around, but this was a project that was undertaken by the Higher Education Academy that had a key role, I think, in impacting on British assessment. That is to try and get universities to work through a framework of questions to help us really scrutinise and interrogate assessment. So where we are in this process is that that project has taken place and a lot of people are using it. So it's got a number of tenets. We argue it takes you a while to get assessment right, and we're very keen through this project to make sure that mechanisms such as mentoring actually help people make that first step. And if you have no other advice coming out of this session and you're new to assessment, I would really urge you to find an old hand. The English expression is sitting alongside Nelly. That is somebody to sit alongside who will help you to understand that assessment always is going to be a bit of a complex task. It's never completely precise. I've done lots of workshops with people where we've had 70 or 80 people who teach the same subject in the same room, assessing the same pieces of work, and you can actually end up with very large gaps between the marks given to two people in that way. And even really experienced assessors fail to agree completely on a mark. So it really isn't sensible to argue about 54 or 55 or 66 and 67. And what we're arguing, I think, those of us who've been involved in this project and lots of others, is that assessment isn't just about summing stuff up when you've finished. Assessment really is about learning. Good morning, Jeff Chris. Nice to see you in the room. I know Kay Samble's in the room, and I refer here to the University of Northumbria model that she and Liz McDowell helped to put together. That was stemming from the Assessment for Learning Centre for Excellence in Teaching and Learning. These Centres for Excellence were put together by the UK government to try and put a lot of support into helping universities across the UK and beyond to look at good practice and share it more widely. Thanks, Kay, for your comment. I think you're absolutely right. Lots of discussion. I think it really takes plenty of time talking about assessment because, as our green sector says, good assessment really emphasises authentic and complex tasks. And good assessment isn't just about tick box. Good assessment really about trying to make sure that we are challenging our students and giving them difficult things to do. I like Graham Gibbs' expression that's represented here in the right-hand quartile mode on my screen, that actually we need to make sure we're using summative assessment rigorously but sparingly, and formative assessment very, very frequently. Summative assessment, I always suggest, is about its principal purpose, is about summing up, judging, evaluating. It's often endpoint and often involves numbers. Formative assessment is very often continuous, or at least more than once. It's incremental. Its principal purpose is actually informing and transforming students. If students aren't changed by feedback, why are you giving it to them? So formative assessment is informing, transforming, and it often involves lots of words. So Kay and colleagues have suggested that we need to offer lots of low-stakes confidence-building opportunities and practice, particularly in the first semester of the first year, and the first half of the first semester of the first year. And as Kay and Liz and colleagues argue, it needs to be rich in formal feedback. It needs to have lots of comments and lots of opportunities for students to have a look themselves at their own work, as well as opportunities for peers to collaborate, looking at drafts and so on. This is quite tough for new assessors. Very tough indeed, but I think it's one of the key ways in which students really get to know how they're doing. If students are evaluating their own and each other's work, they can, using Roy Sadler's terms, gauge the quality of their own work during the actual production of it. So coming up to the top left-hand quartile of that, the deep blue one, we need students to really be able to evaluate how they're doing and direct their own learning. And we can only do that if students really get and understand the names of the game. So as Kay says, formative assessment needs lots of dialogue. I think one of the things that worries me about what happens in universities nowadays, I do an advisory work with a lot of universities, and sometimes the Vice Chancellor will say, oh, well, we're going to just go to one assessment per module, at the end of every module, no work in between, because otherwise our staff will be overwhelmed with assessment and they won't be able to get their research done. But I'm sorry, that doesn't work. We've got to give prompt, formative, developmental feedback. This has got to change people's behaviour. And as Jeff says, developing students' ability to receive feedback on the quality of their decision making is really important. One of the things I learned early on, being trained by the Open University back in the 80s on how to assess at HE level, is how important the language and the tone of your feedback can be. The difference between building and destroying confidence. One of the exercises I do with people in workshops is to say, think about the worst thing anybody ever said about your work through feedback. And some of the stories people come out with are quite disheartening and worrying. We can see students having their confidence absolutely destroyed. I really like that comment in the chat box. I can't see it's from. You really need to know what good work looks like. David Gorm talks about how do we know whether the students have done good work. So students as Neil and McFarlane Dick, whose work on feedback I think is the best around, they argue that students really need to learn from this assignment and move confidently onto the next one, what Graham Gibbs calls feed forward. That is not just corrections, not just comments, but something that gives you information to get better at what you're doing, to improve your performance and change your practices. So it shouldn't be about you haven't tried hard enough unless you work on a one-to-one basis. The comments should focus on the work and how to make it better rather than make personal comments. And it needs to be received in plenty of time. This is one of the things I battled with when I was working full-time in university, trying to argue that we had to return work pretty fast. We brought in a 3-week rule. Lots of universities are now bringing in a 2-week rule. That is to say, return feedback with comments within a 15-day or even a 10-day period. I think if we don't do that, students have no chance to learn from it. And the longer we leave it, the more likely it is that we will simply, the students will simply just look at it and reject it or not take any notice at all because they're too busy to look back on the past. They're too busy getting on with their next assignment. Yes, Tim, I think computer-based assessment, advanced assessment can be a really useful supplement. And again, we're going to use different kinds of assessment at different stages in the progress of the student. And indeed, peer assessment, peer feedback is really useful. I have argued over the years from the time that Peter Knight and I worked on this approach, the fit-for-purpose approach to assessment, we need to decide for every single assessment activity, and this applies to novice assessment as well as to experienced ones. What are we trying to do with assignment? Why are we assessing? What's the purpose? Are we about building confidence for early stage students, or are we trying to make sure that a doctor is fit to practice, or help students know how to improve, or to give a final grade? Because the kind of rationale we have for an assignment is going to determine exactly how we're going to do it. My next question is, what exactly are we assessing? Are we assessing product or process, work in progress or final result, theory or practice, or both? And I think sometimes we're not always completely clear about what it is we're trying to assess. Sometimes we end up assessing what's easy to assess, or what we've always done in the past. So, next question, how do you assess? Well, when Peter Knight and I wrote our book, Assessing Learners in Higher Education, back in the 90s, we came up with 160 methods of assessment, and yet, certainly in the UK, and my experience globally, we end up mainly using exams, MCQs, essays, formal reports, but we're not using the more stretching, demanding, challenging, and I would argue authentic types of assessment, like portfolios, case studies, oral exams, computer simulations, patchwork texts, in the way that we could more extensively. We do use them, but very often, particularly if you've got a VC who's asking you to spend less time on assessment, we fall back on the easiest answers. Yes, Natalie, teachers are using assessment to keep students consistent. I regard it as the punctuation by which students know what they're supposed to be doing. And that's why I agree with Max York, who says the first 6 weeks of the first semester of the first year are really important. And we need, in that time, to get students to start developing and modeling the practices that will stand them in good stead throughout their programs. So we do need to use diverse assessment. Let's try and find the assessment that's fit for the process, not just the one that's easiest to administer. I like that point, Jeff, about students need to be involved in the design of assessment, not necessarily designing, right, what we're going to do this time, but more perhaps using experienced students or last year students or students in the 3rd year, talking about the 1st year of assessment, and so on. So, 4th question, who are the best agents for assessment? Well, certainly my experience globally is that probably about 80 to 85% of assessment is actually undertaken by tutors, and yet there are so many other agents who can actually engage in assessment. It's really important that peers are involved, not just the peers within one's own group, intra-peer assessment, but also peers in other groups, inter-peer assessment. We need students to be assessing themselves, but who else? Employers, practice supervisors, people that supporting students out on placement. The key thing, of course, if we're using a variety of assessors, is to try and make sure we're all talking on the same lines, everybody's sharing criteria. And that means we all have to have practice and rehearsal the opportunities. Last question in my list. When should you be assessing? Well, I argue that assessment should be a nourishing process. It needs to be throughout a student's study life. We need it early on so they can let themselves know how they're doing. It's very disheartening, my experience at university, no assessment at all for a long period of time, over a term, and then suddenly it felt more terrifying. Do we need it midpoint to highlight issues, direct students in the right direction? Endpoint, so as to assure standards? I would argue very strongly in all of those. We need it to be incremental, to allow a progressive build-up of experience. So, when we're thinking particularly about first steps in assessment, I'd like you all, as you're sitting there, to think back to the first time you ever did an assessment at all and ask yourself what it felt like. If one or two people could type a few words into the text box, or what it felt like when you were first having to do your very first assessment activity. For me, it was terrifying. So type away a few texts, a few words in the text box, or what it felt like for you. A puzzle, no idea what was expected, daunting, scary, confusing, overwhelming. If there's anybody who's a real novice to assessment, who's looking at this webcast or looking at the audio, I hope you'll find this quite reassuring, because there's a lot of people here who are experienced assessors who are describing it as boring and so on. So what I would say is, when designing a new assessment, when you're thinking about how you're doing it, have a look at the course outcomes and make sure you're mapping student performance against what's expected of them. This is assuming you're doing the designing. Map against what they're supposed to do, learning outcomes. John Biggs calls this constructive assignment. John Biggs, one of my heroes, says, and I'm just going to bowdlerize, I'm afraid, he's thinking here, before you start doing anything, you need to think in advance what students need to know and do by the end of the programme, and you check that against the course outcomes. Then you think about how you're going to get them to that position. Then you think about how you're going to know whether they've got it or not, and then you're going to find out how effectively you've done the whole process. So if we constructively align our assignments, that means we've got to make sure they do what it says on the tin. Therefore, if it says in the learning outcomes, by the end of this programme, students will be able to debate articulately the key factors that influence whatever, then debate, that verb, has got to appear in what they do in the assignment. It doesn't mean they've got to write about it, I don't think, necessarily. It means that they might actually be speaking or interacting or engaging. So once we've got those key student outcomes, then we can work out what the criteria for the assignment are. And we can make sure that we cover all the things we say we're going to cover. And then a key issue that assessors and students often skim over is the weighting of marks. Is everything worth the same amount? No doubt you will have all seen students who haven't done as well as they could do because they put all their energy into one bit without realising that that only carries a certain proportion of marks. So I think it's really important that we're clear about how the different criteria are weighted one against another, and that our students are too. Then we need to check assessment plans against any professional subject and regulatory bodies, the UK QAA, AQAA, your own university's assessment regulations, and try and make sure that we're not going to frighten anybody or cheese anybody off in the regulatory framework. I think that quality assurance is the key way by which universities keep us all safe and keep our students safe. And so looking through the regulations before you write an assignment isn't just towing the line. It's actually about making sure that you're not setting up problems later on for your students. And the key thing that I'll keep coming back to again and again today is how important it is to keep checking with a more experienced colleague any aspects of assessment that are difficult or complex for you. It isn't a matter of showing weakness. It's not being a wimp. Really do show things to your colleagues that will let you and them gain a shared understanding of what the standards are. So maybe some of the more experienced people on this webinar could type into the text box now a couple of bits of advice you got from colleagues early on about how to make your assessment better. I'll pause a moment to see if anybody does that. It will also reassure me that somebody else other than me is here. Somebody type into a text box and tell me they're here, please, because I can't see anything coming in the text box. The thing I asked for was some people who are experienced assessors to talk about the best advice they got.
Hi, Sally. Yeah, people are typing things in, so I'm not sure if you're able to see it in the bottom left-hand corner.
I think, oh, that's good to hear that, because that's disappeared from my screen. Right, now I've got, I can see them now. So recently ran an assessment workshop for staff and realised that we need to do one developing proper learning outcomes first. Good point. They felt incompetent, unclear of expectations. Cut out a picture of a kangaroo and colour it in without any spaces. I love that.
That was quite a while ago, Sally. You might want to scroll down to the bottom to see if the links are coming up.
All right. Your assessment, is your assessment really measuring what you think it is? Yeah. And is it authentic? Thank you. Oh, go back to that next slide about starting to assess then. So review, I can see what went wrong there because it wasn't scrolling down for me. Thank you, Matthew. So we need to review assignments against the criteria after initial read-through and make really basic judgments. I always say to people, a good thing to do is to pick up the 10 or so assignments, and I use, and you can probably see I've got my hand held up, 5 criteria. Is it absolutely stonkingly good? I couldn't possibly do better myself. Is it pretty good? A few little problems. Fair enough, quite good. Is it a bit ropey, a bit flaky? Is it absolutely grim? And that can help us come up with, in the UK system, first, 2-1, 2-2, third, and fail. If you throw them on the floor in piles, have had a quick look at it, you then start to get confidence. So I wouldn't try writing on the very, very first assignments you look at until you've read a few through. Yes, Alice, clear and simple instructions are important. Yes, cultural sympathy, contextualization is really important as well. So review the criteria. When you've got your first big pile, does it match the criteria? And then you can start putting it into those 5 broad bands. And then you can start putting marks on them. When you're doing it for the first time, it really helps to say to somebody, I've done 20 here, give a quick look and see if we can compare the marks I've given and the marks you've given. And show them some examples of your very top graded one, a couple of reasonable ones in the middle, and a couple, if you can, of work that you don't think merits a pass, or so that you engage standards together. I think it really means actually a bit of tandem marking in the first instance. And if people aren't willing to help, that suggests you might have to remind them that we all have to start out somewhere. My experience is actually lots and lots of people are really willing to help. As Kay says, it's a good idea to have a moderation meeting, and a moderation meeting doesn't have to be a physical meeting. It can, sorry, I didn't mean to go forward there. It can mean doing stuff virtually. I quite like Pauline Neal of Plymouth University's way of assessing master's dissertations. She basically locks all her markers in a single room, feeds them lots of food, and makes sure that everybody's working on the same line by having chats at every tea break. People don't always like having to come into university to do it, but there's some real benefit in that. So don't expect marks to conform to a normal distribution curve unless you've got cohorts of thousands. I've had arguments when I've been chairing exam boards where I've said to people, you can't really expect to have a normal distribution curve on 50 students, and they really want them to be. You are going to have some years where there's lots of great pieces of work, and some years where you don't have very many at all. And I don't think you should worry too much about that. You need to just make sure that you're aligning what you're doing with the criteria, and you're getting some advice on how effective these things that you're marking is alongside other people's work. I like that comment. Ask yourself when you're marking, what can I see in their work that shows me the action verb? Thank you very much for that contribution. I think it also helps not to just pick them up and put them down, pick them up and put them down, or even worse, to try and sit and mark a great big pile all in one go. The experts advise you should be standing up every hour and looking out the window, and you need to be getting up and leaving the room, doing something else every 3 hours. And I would suggest that anybody, if you want to keep your sanity, nobody can do more than 6 hours marking in a single day. Don't worry at the beginning that you're going to be very slow. You do speed up later. And if you do need to take extra time, you might have to ask in your first year of assessing for a bit of help on how to do this. So, and don't expect it all to be easy. But as you become more confident, keep talking to your colleagues. So you're building up what we described in the marked improvement guide that I talked about earlier on, as steadily building up shared standards within your subject community. Feedback, for me, is assessment is the engine that drives learning. Feedback is the Castrol GTI or other brand of oil that keeps your engine running. Feedback actually makes students learning happen, I would argue. So we need to make sure that the feedback is doing something for the students, that's actually helping the students. So if we're marking, that is making judgments on student work that results in a letter or grade, it's really important that they have that. But it's also important, particularly for students in the early stages, they have lots and lots of help and advice on how to change, improve, enhance, not just for the people at the bottom end of the scale, but for the people at the top end of the scale too. So the feedback carries the burden of learning, I would argue. And rather than say something like needs improvement, you might like to type in some of the most devastating and useless comments that you've received on a piece of work. Something vague like needs improvement, or my worst one, okay as far as it goes. What are you supposed to do with that? Instead, I think you should be giving specific steps of what students need to be doing. So don't write references. Beside unreferenced work, point students towards the guidance on your university's website or in the handbook or anywhere else about how they can actually conform with your assessment, your referencing guidelines. And Matthew, I like your actionable feedback, feedback that leads to action. And I was trained by the British Open University, which consistently in the UK gets the highest ratings on assessment in the National Student Survey. And what the Open University in the UK still do is in your first year of assessing, everything you write, all your work, all your assignments are monitored by somebody else. After that, you go up to 1 in 3. Then when you're an experienced assessor, up to 1 in 10. And I think that's a way of making sure that however experienced we are, we're still all working to the same guidelines. And they monitor you for not just how much feedback you give, but also what kinds of advice you're giving, how helpful it is, and the kind of language you're using. And you need to make sure you're giving enough, but not so much that you exhaust yourself and your students. So I'm just going to check some of these comments coming through on the textbook. I didn't like your writing was pedestrian. The only thing that's consistent about your work is the appalling spelling. Oh gosh, actually written on the student's work. Yes, this seems like it's written by somebody who didn't speak English as first language, and that, of course, is an inappropriate comment, particularly if somebody's first language isn't English. Again, I want new assessors to be kind to yourself. I really want you to make sure that you are not exhausting yourself, but I do want you to think that actually for some students, particularly your students from disadvantaged backgrounds, this is make or break for them. Kay mentioned a student who left after appalling feedback, and I think that's really true. I look back to myself as a no head, no higher education in the family tradition, and I know that for me, actually, some of the feedback I got made me feel like packing my trunk and going home. That sounds a bit Harry Potter, but I really did have a trunk in those days. So we need to make sure that we use the feedback in the format our university or format expects us to do. So if your university says online, do it. If they say use a pro forma or a rubric, do it. If they say face-to-face, do it, or email or whatever. But do also think about supplementing what your university expects you to do with other means. So if you are giving all feedback, why not keep a voice recording of it, both for the student to refer to later and for you to be able to access? Got to do it in the turnaround time. If you're struggling, ask for help. You won't be popular, but it's better than getting to the end of 3.5 weeks and say, I haven't done it. Next one for me is really important. You need to remember that the people at the end of this process are warm-blooded human beings for whom your comments are going to actually have a very high impact. If you are crushing, they may well be crushed. We do want students to improve, and actually the better you know the student, the better relationship you have with the student, the more robust you can be and the more colloquial. I remember a tutor on a fine art course I did once for fun telling me my work was rubbish, and I just taught him on a postgrad cert and told him that his feedback was rubbish because you shouldn't use words like that in formative feedback. But that's a different thing, isn't it? Because you are able to be robust and colloquial with somebody you're standing next to and have a warm relationship with. But if it's somebody you don't know, you really need to think through how that feedback is going to help them. So make sure that you're not undermining students. Make sure that you're helping them to improve. That's hard, and that's why I really like the idea of people, before they start assessing, having the chance to look through some other tutors' work from a previous year and see what kind of comments they've written. So ask around, see who else in your faculty is regarded as a good and fair and effective assessor. Sorry for clicking through back to them. It's not what I want to do. And make sure that you are following their guidelines. Have a look at what other people's work looks like. So Joe says, on my online stuff, like audio cell feedback. I think audio feedback is really helpful, and I like Bob Rotherham's work. The JISC project sounds good, which is still available on the JISC website, probably about 8 years old now. And Bob Rotherham's project said if you give students written feedback, they read it between 0 and 2 times, but if you give them audio feedback, they listen to it between 1 and 17 times. They need to listen to it because in an audio file, the mark is at the very end. As Eugene says, that makes really sense so that you refer to written comments and you sometimes have to scroll through. But yes, Eugene, people actually have to listen to it then, don't they? And if you listen more than once, that can actually have huge benefit, particularly for students who might find your speech a bit fast or your accent a bit heavy. Right, this is the bit we're going to get you working on. And what I want to do is a very much cut down exercise from the one I'm going to be using with Anglia Assessment album work. And that is, I'm going to give you 2 little pieces for you to look at. Remember, what you're going to be looking at in a moment is an extract from a 500-word activity where nursing students were asked to critically reflect on one critical incident that they've observed. So write about describing the events as you understood them, describe the feelings you have, outline what you've learned from this event about yourself and your chosen profession, Give a similar situation in the future. What would you do the same and what would you do differently? In what ways are the theories you've learned on the course helping to make sense of what you've observed on placement? And what do you feel now you need to do to help you be effective as a student and ultimately as a nurse? You might say, that's actually a pretty tough brief to ask a first semester, first year nursing student to do in 500 words. But trust me, I have actually seen activities that look like this. So here's the important thing you as a marker need and the students need. The assessment criteria is going to be 30% your ability to identify a relevant incident within your placement and address it appropriately by demonstrating a commitment to professional practice. Yes, Tim, tough word limit, but as I say, lots of people are using little ones like this just to get students started. 20 marks for presentation and clarity, grammar, referencing, fluency, and then 50 marks, the big thing, is the ability to reflect critically at the time of the incident, but drawing on previous experience. So again, it's quite tough. So there's the assessment brief again. There's the criteria. And what I'm going to ask you to do, and for once I'm going to shut up and let you have a read. I'm going to give you about 3 minutes to read this one and decide how good you think it is against those criteria. Okay, I'm going to shut up now and let you have a look at that. Okay, I hope you had a chance to have a look at that. Now let's have a look at the second one. So Arrow was the first one, Tina is the next one. Okay, I've given you a chance to look at those. I'm just going to skip back and let you have a look at this weighting, criteria, the activity, Arrow, Tina. Okay, all my materials that I produce, this stuff, the stuff that's on my website, I've pasted on my website all the workshop materials I always use for everything. And as I'm now in the autumn stage of my career, everything I do is open education resource. If you choose to use these, be really careful, because keeping the typos in is a complex task, because people are always trying to correct your typos. So I've kept some typos in one of these, and if you do use these yourself or activities with your colleagues, try and make sure you don't lose the typos. Now, here's the bit where Matthew told you at the beginning, we've got some voting buttons at the bottom, and he's reminding you in the text box. If you have a look at the right-hand side, you can vote if you think Arrow would pass the assignment, A. If you think Tina would pass the assignment, put B. If you think both would pass, use C. If you think neither would pass, use D. And if you haven't got the faintest idea which is a perfectly acceptable position to be in, do E. Good question, Tim. We'll stick with the UK pass mark, which is 40%. And that in itself is quite interesting. When I worked in Sweden once at their med school, where it was pass mark was 80%, they said to me, "You mean really that students using who are doing med schools in med work in the UK, you allow students who've got more than half of the work wrong are allowed to practice?" And I said, that's not how the pass mark really works. Because the pass mark is in the UK, it's a threshold of where we say, are we happy for them to go forward or not? I think quite a lot of people have voted, and some people say they're borderline, and some people say that they don't feel ready to judge. There's quite a few E's in there. Well, it's quite hard to write an activity like that. I'm just noting from Johanna, we're skipping percentage, we verbalise what's needed. Hello, that's great. I'm really interested to hear that, but I will keep using my 80% pass mark for the med school at Umbria as an example, because it's quite interesting for people in the UK to realise that our 40% pass mark is regarded as bizarre and overtly generous. So what I've said here is they're not supposed to be either of them disastrously bad or stupendously good. I think it's probably quite easy for us to write an assignment that's terrible practice run and one that's wonderful. I think actually showing students through would be quite an interesting thing to do, because Arrow is fluent and accurate, no typos in Arrow, whereas Tina's work is full of errors. Arrow uses references, and they're correct, but just look at the date on them. They're really, really old, and this is very straightforward. Wikipedia, there's a conversation to have with Arrow about how you find your references. Yes, Alice, Arrow identifies an incident, Tina doesn't. Tina uses no references, but I've got a warm spot for both of these students because they're both demonstrating honesty, a commitment to professionalism. The extent differs. I think, depending on the experience of the markers, the nature of the course, I think it's quite likely that markers would give quite diverse marks for each of these examples, depending on the context and experience. And both of them have their flaws. These examples demonstrate how complex and nuanced and demanding the process is, requiring us to use all of our powers of judgment. The outcomes aren't really clear-cut. If you want me to put my hand on the line and say what I think, I would say that they're both around the borderline. And as this was going to be the first assignment of the first semester of the first year, I was very keen that we write the assessment criteria and make our judgments so that even people who are borderline on that very first assignment just pass. Because if we recruited the right students, then we would expect all of the students to be able to do the first assignment okay. Naturally, would this sort of exercise help if used with students to understand marking? I really think so. But also have a look at on the Angular Assessment Album site that I mentioned earlier in the conversation, and look at the biscuit exercise. If you live in a country that has biscuits, that's a really good exercise at helping students to understand criteria. Jackie, you're right. You should be given a pre-assessment reflective activity, helping them to know how to be reflective. And you're quite right. I think Tina does just report. So both of them have their flaws. I think they're both bumping around the borderline. And as every experienced assessor will tell you, actually, the borderlines are the really difficult bit of assessment. Most of us can pick out a brilliant piece of work. Most of us can pick out a disastrous piece of work. Many of us find it really difficult on the borderline. Tim, since it is a first assessment, much more interesting question would be what kind of feedback would you give to students, not what mark. However, what we need to be aware is that we are often actually forced into making a mark judgment very early on in our assessment careers. Yes, Tina may have the necessary skills, but not in answering the questions. And which of these two are the purpose of the assessment? I'd like to have a conversation with the students after having done that, talking to them about exactly those issues. Next picture I'm showing you is an exam taking place in Afghanistan. And I use this as, for me, an exercise in cultural humility. I once had the Minister of Education, Higher Education for Afghanistan working with me for 3 days, and we talked solidly about assessment for 3 days. And at the end, he said to me, well, thank you, that's been helpful. I'm going to go back to my country and change assessment. And I said, what are you going to do? He said, I'm going to bring in written exam papers. And I thought, what terrible things have I done to this man that makes him think a written exam paper is the answer to his question? Well, he said to me, well, what we do at the moment is we stand at the front and read out the question, and then the students write down the answers. And I thought, well, hang on, just before you throw the baby out with the bathwater, just before you radically change practices, think of the benefits of what you do. One of the benefits of reading out the questions is that it paces students. It is also a means by which students are able to hear. Sometimes when they're nervous, they'll hear better than they can see. So don't throw it out entirely. I would argue for a mixed style assessment, and I think we all need to be culturally sensitive to the fact that the students in our classroom will often have had a very mixed bag of experiences of assessment in their originating nations, in their originating institutions of education. We need to be humble as assessors in recognising that some students need a culturalisation into our cultural practices in assessment without saying it's necessarily the best thing around. So, coming up to the end of the session, some concluding thoughts. When you're assessing as a novice assessor, you're likely to encounter students and colleagues, some of whom are sticklers, some of whom are softies, some of whom are very experienced but actually haven't learned a lot from experience. I like the comment earlier, somebody said where they got into trouble for being too kind and gentle with students. We've got to try and gauge it right. No single nation has a monopoly on doing it right. No single person can tell you exactly how to do it. The key thing I keep going back to is the importance of having a dialogue around assessment, that people talk to each other, listen to each other, share and compare. We need to make sure that we have a shared understanding of the standards and also the practices. And that means cultural practices as well as the day-to-day practice of how we assess. I think it's really important that we recognise how hard it is to do this job well. It's really tough to assess well. But I can promise you, new assessors, that it does get better with practice. A lot of people say it still remains quite hard work. I think part of it goes back to designing assessments that are actually productive for the students and help them show their best. But the key point I finish with is that actually assessment is probably the most important job you do for your peers. So really, really well worth time and effort in doing it well. I want to pass over to Matthew now. I see that Shija wants to ask a question, but Matthew, I think I need to hand over to you now because we're nearly finishing the hour.
Hi Sally, yes. What we'll do is, Shija, if you have a question, would you like to press your talk button? I notice you're on a mobile device, so it's normally on the top or the bottom center of the screen, I think. So Shija, if you can hear us, would you like to ask a question through your microphone? Even you put up your hand with a little red thing. Assuming that wasn't a mistake. Others, if you would like to type questions into the text chat box, and then Sally can read them from there. I suspect Shija may have pressed the button by accident, so if she chimes in at any moment in time. What I'm going to do is just forward the slides because I want to display these, some good resources here from Sally, and these will get captured in the recording. And I'll also stick up, no worries, Suji, that's fine. I'll also stick these slides onto our website as well. So as well as the recording, there'll be the slide package, and you'll be able to retrieve them all from there. The last slide is just a link to our feedback. So if you could kindly fill our feedback, that would be wonderful. Let me just type that into the... my brain doesn't work when I try and type and talk at the same time.
While Matthew's typing, I'll just say I've typed in. If you have a short, direct question, my email is right on the front of each slide, and I'll do my very best to answer questions if they're brief within the next few days. Thank you, everybody, for joining in.
Yeah, so we are at the end of the hour. So, folks, if you need to leave, that's fine. But you're welcome to stick around for a couple of minutes and ask questions. As I said, please kindly fill our feedback. That would be great. Also want to stick a plug in for the Assessment in Higher Education Conference in the UK. So this webinar is kind of like a preview. And we'll also be doing a second webinar after the conference that will be like a panel-style session. We did that last year and it was quite successful. So look out for that in early, I think it's in July sometime. It'll be on our schedule at any point, and we'll update once we know who the speakers are for that. But otherwise, yes, there's another webinar next month, so you don't have to wait until the end of the year. So remember, another one coming up in a month, early next month. Okay, so thank you, Sally. I'm going to stop the recording. If you've got any last words you'd like to say?
No, all I have to say is thank you very much for everybody. I found that an interesting session. It's a challenge to look at the textbook at the same time, but thank you everybody for all your contributions.
Yes, indeed. Trying to do 2 or 3 things at once is definitely a challenge. So thanks, Sally. We're stopping the recording, and we'll hopefully see you all back again next month.